some manufacturers go out of their way to make sure that car will last the lifetime, and yet other manufacturers just can't get it right. We're going to talk about today 10 of the worst car engines that won't last 50,000 miles no matter what you do. Let's get into it now. Life's too short to drive boring cars. Let's just get right to it. The first engine that's one of the worst, not necessarily in this order, is what's in this vehicle behind me. Everybody said, get the V8, you need lots of power. The V8 has power to pull. The V8 sounds great, it's amazing. Well, let's talk about it, because it's not quite so amazing in this particular generation of a BMW. The engine you find in this vehicle obviously isn't more than enough to get it going along. Obviously BMW and the traditional trademark grills as well as those angel eyes make this car very desirable in a lot of circles. Unfortunately, the engine that you find when you're associating it with the X550i is where you have some of the issues, because when we're talking about that, that generally means engines that are identified within the 2008 to 2012 model years that have that 50i designation and don't begin and end with just the X5. You can also find them in 5 Series and 7 Series cars, and that is the wonderful BMW N63, one of the early generations. Now, they have gotten a lot better, but this first generation of that V8 is absolutely breathtakingly ruthless. And why is that, and what's actually going on with that type of engine? Let me explain. First of all, we won't even talk about that generation of vehicle anyway, with some of the other problems with electrics, air ride suspension that drops because the airbags start to let air out. Most of the issues are related to that engine. When we're talking about the 50 series, it's that hot V, because it's a V8. In the channel, they've decided to put 2 turbos in there, and those 2 turbos generate a lot of heat because exhaust temperatures make excessive heat. It gets glowing hot, and that glowing hot heat actually starts to melt out parts within that V of the engine. Of course, it takes a toll on gaskets, so you get leaks, both coolant, oil leaks, wiring, plastics, all of the other parts. Great, some of that's cosmetic, some of it's coolant leaks. Of course, you do get coolant leaks because that's one of the problems, water pumps, thermostats. The other issue is because those leaks, you end up with a situation that results in excessive oil consumption, because you end up with the valve guide seals that guide the valves and keep the oil below the engine. Those start to melt too, unfortunately, because of all that exhaust temp heat, and then you wind up eating lots of oil. These are oil eater 9000s, unfortunately. So then you have a heavy oil consumption, coupled with the fact that BMW said BMW Care, they were going to try to take care of some of the customers. Allegedly, that was really just moving people along to try to coach them and basically say, hey, look, we'll try to take care of it as best we can. It does ultimately often mean new rebuilds or engine top ends, but there's a lot of problems with that. There's also excessive battery draw, just has to do with that vehicle in general. But related to the engine, you do also have other big issues. For example, fuel injectors. They say leaking injectors are one of the big problems here with that engine as well. And because of that, what ends up happening, the fuel winds up going down into the cylinders, leaking down. It doesn't necessarily leak externally, it leaks internally, and then you wind up with washing of the cylinders. If you wash your cylinders, that takes away the oil film. No oil film, move that cylinder, it starts to scratch the internals. You get the rest, right? So the engine becomes toast in a very short period of time if you end up losing injectors. Another big issue is the timing chains. Timing chains on these vehicles, that keeps the pistons and the valves in synchronization, so you bring in fuel, exhaust, and spark and all that good stuff. If that synchronization goes out of whack, you basically can wind up with piston and valve connection and catastrophic boom, and then your engine's toast again. So that's another big issue, because those timing chains would stretch, or sometimes the ramps would break and let go, and then you'd skip a cog. So clearly it was a bad design right from the get-go. I guess fundamentally it was a great design. In practice and execution, not so much. Instead, if you really have to have this generation of BMW, it also doesn't come without its issues. But for example, or you go with one of these particular vehicles, it's the 35D. Yes, you can have still some of the airbag issues, and you do have their own sets of problems, but the engine fundamentally is very solid on one condition. You do the full EGR, DPF delete on that vehicle, then you have a fundamental engine that's strong, good for a lot of miles. I had one, and the only place that kept dying was on the DPF heater system, EGR, and all of that plugging off. Get rid of all of that, do a full delete, and that engine's good for a lot of miles. Ours was at 140,000 miles when I sold it, and the gentleman who took it before was going full delete, and now he's good probably for another 200,000 miles. So if you need to have that generation, go deleted X5 diesel. And another one is the engine that's tucked in this beautiful little car, and when I say beautiful, I mean it. They're fun, they're great looking vehicles, and with the right engine, they can be a blast as well as the right transmission. But unfortunately, there is an engine configuration you want to avoid like the plague. But let's take a look And I'll show you, even this one here, I saw it being towed in the other day, and I'll show you something why I'm just confirmed in saying what I'm saying. I mean, clearly this is a Mini, which is also built by effectively BMW, but the engine in that, under that hood, is a collaboration between BMW, Peugeot, and Citroën. That's right, this one obviously was towed in there. Beautiful headlights. Look at the plastic finish on there. This is Baker Street style in the house. Obviously, look at those great little retro mirrors and lots of sun coming in through the massive sunroof right there. Hot little exhaust tip there, and look at these beautiful wheels. Absolutely gorgeous little car. Retro styling all the way around. But look what I found on this vehicle. They literally say, do not start the engine. Probably because there's something catastrophic about to happen there, or just did. So the engine I'm talking about is the 1.6 liter, they call it the Prince engine. And it started from back in about 2006 till present. And it literally has problems galore. Now, again, as I say, there's engines that you'd probably want to ramp up to. This isn't necessarily one of them. Fuel system related issues as well as poor running can contribute to this car's problematic areas. And other issues are the timing chain that coordinates the timing of the valves and the pistons can actually slack off and become loose with time. And when that happens, you basically got a condition where the vehicle runs poorly, sloppy, and you never quite really know why, and you end up chasing problems like fuel injectors and spark, but yet it relates more to timing that's off that far. EGR valves, exhaust gas recirculation, is a problem with almost every model, diesel or gas, as well as the fuel injectors are known to have bad seals that let fuel fumes waft into the engine and even into the cabin, which makes it very uncomfortable, annoying, and potentially dangerous. Right, if you have open fuel, open flame all mixing together, it sounds like a recipe for a disaster. So clearly not a great situation. If you need to have one of these vehicles, go with the turbocharged 4-cylinder, a Cooper S. Some of the later generations past 2014, stick with maybe a 15 or newer model year, and you could get yourself in a fun, frivolous little driving experience in the BMW Cooper. The next dumpster fire engine that wouldn't make it up to 50,000 miles without doing some major intervention is what's behind or under the hood of a vehicle like this. Well, what exactly are we looking at here? Well, clearly a big domestic boat. But what is it? Well, this is the Palm Springs Special, as you can tell. Yeah, because it's a Cadillac, and look at all the quality control on that plastic trim. Big, beautiful headlights, but back in 2006 is where things really went wrong for this brand. Yeah, they wanted to use that big, powerful V8 engine. Yeah, they've got some great touches. No sunroof on this tank, but they do have the chrome rims, which again is great for Palm Springs. Here, big, beautiful taillights, and you got a set of quad exhaust tips. And what we're talking about here is the V8 Northstar engine. What we're looking at here is a DHS, but realistically, DTS is what we're talking about here. So many problems. Where should we start? And where do we end? I could talk about this all day, but actually, let's take it from the top. You can get valve cover, gasket seal leaks, carbon buildup in the engine, which is easy to fix. You just got to do some low-cost maintenance, but it's a problem. Compression was also altered because of some of that carbon buildup, but piston rings here as well were a common failure point and led to massive oil consumption. So you actually had heavy oil, carbon buildup, leaking coolant. Water pumps would fail. The rear main seal that goes out to the drive to the transmission would known to leak as well, so you'd wind up with a puddle of oil underneath. And this thing leaked, consumed, burned oil, coolant every which way from inside out. Part of that was also because the infamous valve cover gasket. You'd blow a valve cover and then you'd essentially internally start eating some coolant. That's a bad scene because you start gobbling up coolant, you misfire, you also introduce moisture into the combustion chamber, which is never good, and you wind up with black exhaust smoke coming out the tailpipe. It wasn't also uncommon to experience oil pump, and hey, if your oil pump lets go, you don't put oil into the engine where you need it, and then you basically go boom! Also, water pumps were notorious for these vehicles, so not only did you leak coolant externally or through the blown heads, but you also had water pumps that often would give up the ghost. So it was just a poorly built engine. Nobody who ever owned one of those Cadillac engines ever was very satisfied with it, and they guaranteed did not last over 50,000 miles. The next engine that's horrible, that clearly you'll find in one of these, you'll find it in many other vehicles like Volkswagen Passats as well, but we're looking at the Audi A6, 97 to about 2005, and there's a series of turbo diesel engines, the 2.5 liter V6, lots of problems. Yeah, it had a lot of good performance, but it had a lot of negative attributes. And you could tell this older generation of Audi A6 just by simply looking at some of the headlights. You could tell that's the older generation, and this older generation here too. The grille, the headlights, clearly older style Audis. This one here has been rode hard, put away wet, and a little bit of crust around the edges. A vehicle that's seen some of its better days, but it's not about the exterior, it's not about the paint or the scratch or the rust or any of that. It's what you'll find in some of these vehicles like the Passat or this Audi A6, including the all-road, are some of the engine codes like AFB, AKN, AYN, BCZ, BDO, BFC, AKE, BAU, and BDH. That was a mouthful, but yes, you can also find them in Skodas. Like I said, within the VAG group, that engine was quite prevalent. Now, it had great performance, and it was actually quite economical, but there was an inherent issue, and some of it was contributory because the brand actually advised on extended oil service intervals, and that led to a catastrophic issue, which you'd find in a lot of these engines, preventing them from running all that long, and 50,000 miles would be a stretch, to say the least, which is ridiculous because most diesel engines are inherently designed and should be designed to run hundreds of thousands of miles, but not that one. One major issue that contributed to actually having to rebuild engines and them not lasting all that long are the camshafts would wear out way prematurely. The camshafts essentially are those that are connected to the ends of the valves and drive your valve train, allow fuel in, exhaust out, and those camshafts, the lobes would wear down, and then you'd find yourself with poor running conditions and situations where that vehicle just wouldn't run properly at all. Check engine lights and just a host of other issues. Other unfortunate problems with some of these are the thermostat that would actually plug off, and the thermostat's what opens and closes and allow the engine to evacuate heat or not. And sometimes the thermostat would jam up, you overheat that engine. Water pumps, another problem, they'd leak and they'd fail. As well as oil pumps, turbochargers as well, a big problem. Turbochargers blow, you're dealing with a $3,000 or $4,000 repair. So whether it's turbos, water pumps, thermostats, even O2 sensors and leaks intake manifolds and like, there are way too many issues in that 2.5 liter turbo diesel engine even to assume that this thing will go any significant miles. Another major engine problem is related to the specific brand here. Not this Forester per se with the 3.6, but there's other issues in the EJ20 engines. Subaru is actually known for a high level of reliability, and a lot of their engines will run a long time. So this isn't a knock at the whole brand because the brand in general is quite durable. However, there are some problems with specific engines, and they definitely won't last, or they'll cost you a lot of money out of your hard-earned paychecks. I mean, if you're talking about the EJ 205, 207, and 20G engines, they have a lot of issues related to the intercoolers for the air conditioning. You also have stuck piston rings, which is a bad scene because if your piston rings stick up in the cylinder, basically a seized engine. So that is a problem that's common, and it's related to the treatment of that piston ring, and clearly would need some sort of an engine rebuild to unlock that engine. Then we talk about the EJ20 as you'd find over in other cars, for example, like the Forester Legacy and the Impreza, which this is a WRX, but essentially the base model Imprezas carry the 125 all the way up to 140 horsepower NA versions, and that basically you wind up with a knock in cylinder number 4. They are 4 cylinders, so you end up with a knocking noise. Knock, 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 knock. And they're also quite prone to seal leaks and leaking oil all over the place through various seals and gaskets. So not a great engine. Again, not necessarily the WRX STI versions, but certainly the base Imprezas. There's also a very specific number of these Subaru engines that actually have blown head gaskets. They comes on very quickly and easily. I, as a matter of fact, had a friend that had a slightly older generation of Subaru Forester, the old school, the old boxy style as it were, and he actually had an engine. That car was treated immaculately. Oil services way before their time, took care of it to the T, and still wound up with an engine having to be replaced. He took a trip up to the mountains and a little bit of an acceleration up the mountains, and all of a sudden blowing smoke, hearing the knocking noise, and it needed an engine. So a sad state of affairs. There are some weaknesses within the brand. Generally as a whole, they're pretty solid, but the EJ series 2025 are ones to look out for. So what does this vehicle, this one, an Optima, Forte, and a Sorento all have in common? Well, it's the engine that you can find in some of those vehicles that goes back several years, and there's been so many recalls because of one key issue. Well, let's not get silly. There's actually many recalls, 60 recalls in fact, because of engine issues. And the engine in question that has caused lots of heartache are the Theta 2 engines, the GDI engines, and the Gamma GDI engines. Now, what's so bad about those engines? Well, other than the fact over 3,000 fires have occurred and over 100 people have been injured, and even worse in one case, means that the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration is all up in their business over some of these engine issues. Yeah, well, what's causing those engine issues? Well, a lot of times you don't even know. Check engine light, boof, car stops. Other cases, knock, 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 you're hearing a knocking noise, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, the engine just boof, makes a loud noise and clunk and stops. Other cases, poof, it blows up in flames and you have flames billowing out from under the hood. Let's not fool anyone here. This is a scary situation, and the recalls have been there to actually supply support for people who are on the wrong end of that spectrum. It ultimately means many replaced engines on behalf of Kia and Hyundai, which is their sister company, who also have the same issue because they share the same engines. And quite frankly, it's more than an inconvenience. And allegedly, the companies were very, very slow in reacting where the first cases started coming in. Then hundreds of cases came in. Then thousands of cases came in, and it could not be denied because engines were getting replaced left, right, and center. A lot of people were struggling getting those engines replaced or getting rental cars to replace what they were offset by. It was an ugly situation, and now Kia and Hyundai are having to pick up all the pieces that fell on the ground or the smoke that billowed into the sky. The reality is it doesn't take very long to look around to find vehicles that are subject to that recall. There's also been other recalls recently with Kia related to piston rings and bad treatment and issues with them locking up, or air conditioning system problems and ABS modules failing and blowing. So the bottom line is it's a problematic engine configuration, and while you'll find hundreds and thousands of people who are very satisfied with the latest generation from this brand, the reality remains those two engines are ones you definitely want to stay away from. They won't last 50,000 miles, at least without rebuilding or replacing the engine. The next engine, 4GR FSE V6. Yeah, that's the engine, actually what's tucked under that hood. And for those of you who don't necessarily recognize the nomenclature, let me spell that. I can make it a little simpler here for you. Every manufacturer, even the best, Toyota has a misstep once in a while. We know sudden acceleration, they had porous engines, they had little problems here and there, and this is one of those missteps. And this is a Lexus, which is clearly a Toyota product, but let's take a look and I'll explain some of the key issues that they've had here. It is a gorgeous looking car. Look, they do have that big mouth grille that they came out with in this particular brand. You do have the check mark and beautiful wheels. This one's the F Sport, plain Jane little mirrors, simple touch access getting in, and of course there's no sunroof on this unit here. Beautiful tail lights as you circle around, and look, exhaust tips right there, all carboned up, and that's the point because this is an IS-250. Now, don't beat me up too badly. I know a lot of you will say, oh, just use a catch can and do all these things and regular servicing and life's good. But the reality is that engine wasn't all that great. It was a bit of a misstep, and Toyota quickly figured it out. Carbonization is the big one. They're sluggish, they're weak, and they're not necessarily built for longevity like you would expect from the other version, or the 3.5 liter V6 is clearly the engine you want. This is not. This is one that they just sort of missed the boat. Again, if you do extra maintenance above and beyond, you might get some miles out of it, but this car and this engine isn't necessarily built for the lifespan. Now, 50,000 miles might be a stretch. You can probably do some decent miles if you do the maintenance. If you totally neglect it, this car will fall apart. This car is the one that I have to use with a bit of a caveat if you do the maintenance. So it's a great car in general. Lexus, Toyota, almost unbeatable, but this is one of those little specks on the mark of the brand. And here's one that really pains me to talk about this way because it is such a magnificent vehicle to drive, and it's this car in front of me here, and it actually carries an engine that's ruthlessly unreliable, actually to the point where you probably won't get 40, 50,000 miles, at least not without doing some major engine work. And when I mean major, if you have to tear apart the bottom and change out rod bearings and potentially connecting rods, that's pretty major, I would say. That usually means pulling subframe, dropping a whole bunch of hardware, suspension parts, bottom end, and getting a real expert mechanic to actually repair that for you. But what is this and the kind of car we're talking about? Well, there's really only one type of car that engine carried in, and in this BMW world. But let's take a look. Of course, you do have the angel eyes with the traditional kidney grills, but look, snarling nostrils. This here is a specific 3 Series car, but what kind? Yeah, you do have the aggressive front spoiler, beautiful wheels in BMW's fashion. Look, it's an M3. And look, beautiful mirror. Of course, they have that cool little brake right there. And this one here is a convertible. As you can see, it splits into multiple pieces. The interior is quite attractive, and it wears very, very well. That's one thing BMW does well. Of course, one touch access in, Circle around, and of course this is the generational taillights from that time. You do have a set of quad tips. It's a gorgeous car in many ways. This particular one is in convertible format, but you can also get this in a sedan. It's from a generation when they didn't have M4s and they didn't call an M4 a two-door. This was either in a two-door or four-door version. You could get the E90, E92, and the engine that we're talking about is the S65, right? The S65, which is a smaller version of the S85, which is the infamous F1 derived V10 engine from the M5 in the same generation. But this engine, lots of problems. Water pumps, thermostats, it eats that. Water cooling lines everywhere. This will lose oil, this will lose coolant, and more importantly, this will eat rod bearings. After 40, 50,000, 60,000 miles is a stretch, and you're having to tear into it to actually make sure you replace them on time, because these are catastrophic time bombs. We also can't forget about the throttle actuators. When they go bing, check engine light, limp mode, and there's a whole host of other knickknacks and tallywhacks in there that cause this thing a problem. So sadly, the S65 by BMW, beautiful car, sad display of failureship. Many of you are very well aware and well versed in this BMW 3 Series. 2007 to 2012. But it's not just restricted to that. There's an engine under this hood that is known for mass amounts of heartache, heartbreak, vomit, sickness, and just a downright disappointment with the brand. Well, I mean, a lot of the 3 Series cars are very fun to drive, and let's take a close look and understand why, and I'll talk to you about the engine that's tucked under this hood here. Here we have a later version. You can see the update. It's a facelift version of the E90, E92 generation from 07 to 012. This is the later version. Of course, you do have these interesting little eyebrows there, and they have the smaller wheels here. This one's X-Drive. That means it is all-wheel drive, and of course, small mirrors. Of course, we also have a sunroof there, which is good, and easy touch access around. We circle around, we see this style generation of taillights. It's a beautiful car. If you look down the sight lines, it's absolutely wonderful. The interior's looking great too. But if you look under here, somebody's gone and ordered some parts from Worldpack. There's a box of parts and goodies for this vehicle. It looks like based on that part, it might be something, some kind of a sensor, could be a group of plugs. It just could be something catastrophic. But it can't be plugs actually in this case, because the engine we're talking about that is a beast of burden in 2007 to 2012 has to do with a diesel engine. That's right, it's called the N47. It was ruthless. It's the same thing as the N20, which was the gas jobby. The N47 that we have here is the turbo diesel, and it was ruthless. Now, typical BMW fashion, you anticipate electric issues and all those types of fun and frivolity, but the big issue is the turbo diesel engine. Other than the carbon issues that you would expect here, there's no spark plugs because it is ignition compression. And yeah, it's diesel, so it's a diesel engine that's known for timing chains. So you start the engine up and you hear a little rattly, but not your typical diesel rattle, more of like a dragging noise, a noise that's out of sync. It often gets worse, and it often even gets to the point where it just catastrophically just boom, and then the timing chain lets go, because that's from the same generation as the N20, the gas jobby, where they had plastic timing chain ramps that were actually the guides that break and crumble, and then they'd come apart, and then you'd have slack in your timing chain. And of course, if you have too much slack, you could skip a cog and you have a piston and a valve deciding to be best friends and giving each other a great big hug. But that's a reality with the N47, one that likely would not have made 50,000 miles, particularly in the earlier generation because of the imminent failures. And before we get into the last one, right there, be sure if you want to support the channel, right there, hats, shirts, jackets, you name it, just click above there. It takes you into the store. It's just a great way to support, as well as show that you are actually part of the exotic car play place experience. But now let's get into number 10, and we're talking about an engine that you'll find buried under these vehicles. Now, what do we look here? This here is a Volkswagen Jetta. You can find it in Golf, Audis, A3s, A4s, Skodas, you name it, the VAG Group Special. That's right. There's an engine associated with this that have lots of issues. Now, it's specific, I'll mention, it's a diesel. And diesels in these vehicles were also very popular. I mean, these cars came with great alloy wheels, simple little mirrors. Of course, you can't recognize the Mark IV front end on these vehicles. You do have these style of headlights, which is a bit of the transition to the newer design theme. Of course, this one's Volkswagen. As you can see, that's sort of the giveaway on this design. Lots of people carry stuff on the roof because these are very versatile vehicles for the people. But what specific are kind of issues before we actually tell you what the engine code is? Volkswagen's used a couple of different fuel injection processor systems. Siemens and Bosch. It was a Siemens system that seemed to be a little more problematic in the way the vehicle would operate, and so Bosch was clearly the favorite. The dual cam systems in these vehicles had problems with turbochargers, the dual mass flywheels, and many of the other electronics that I've already mentioned, because Siemens was actually a more problematic system. But unfortunately, it was the balance shaft was the large part of the engine problems here. Now, we also know Porsche struggle with a lot of intermediate shaft issues, and very similarly, we have a problem here in more VAG products like we're seeing in this car. Again, in theory, turbo diesel engines are made to run a long time, and sadly, this one was one of those rare exceptions where there was just way too many problems with it. And so what kind of engine code can you expect to avoid right now? Well, you really want to avoid this engine, which is called the EA188. And it's specifically the one with the piezo injectors. Those piezo injectors are huge money. We're talking about $1,800 to $2,000 each if they blow. And they're commonly fail points. So definitely one of those vehicles with the problematic engines you definitely want to avoid like the plague, because it won't make 50,000 miles. And with all of that said, check it out right there. That is some of the most reliable engines on the market today. Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. We'll see you real soon. Bye-bye.